So welcome to Citations. We have 5 talks. So and then we're going to have a discussion at the end. So if you could hold your questions till the discussion part, unless it's something specific about clarification on the talks. So we have our first, and all these talks have also been uploaded into Sketch. So if you, especially for the remote people, if you kind of want your own version without the time lags, you can go ahead and download it off of Sketch. But our first speaker is going to be Raina Jenkins from the Canadian Ocean Works, who's going to be talking about a program they have, a tool that they're developing, I guess, called Minted. And then Alex Ball, who's in the UK at the moment. He'll be speaking remotely, and he'll be speaking about a basically generalized data citation. He helped write some of the documents before ESIP came out with their guidelines. And then Madison will be talking about citation formats from USGS. Heather Brown's going to talk about citations at NOAA, and I'll be talking about the citations at NASA Earth Science and PODAC, and also give a plug for the brand new ESIP data citation guidelines. And then we'll go into the discussion about seeing if what we have for citations for non-traditional, for data and possibly other types of research objects. Are they robust enough, or are they fine? So we'll discuss all about that later. But if Raina, if you want to come up. I just want to make sure everyone can see the screen. Okay, and everyone can see the screen, I hope. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Raina.
Okay. Yep, thank you. So thank you. I'm going to be talking about a project that we have currently funded called Making Identifiers Necessary for Tracking Evolving Data. So, oh, how do I move this? Sorry. On this?
No, on the touchpad.
Little orange arrow. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Nope. I haven't figured this out now. Okay, learning. So yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of context because I'm not sure that everyone here is familiar with Ocean Networks Canada. So I have a map here of some of our assets in ocean observing. We're mainly known for the Neptune Cabled Observatory and also the Venus Cabled Observatories, but we do also have a lot of other ocean assets, smaller coastal observatories, mobile data sets from ships and ROVs and ferries, and a whole bunch of other types of coastal instrumentation like CODAR and weather stations, and also accelerometers on land. So we have a whole suite and really heterogeneous data sets and data streams. These are coming from fixed and mobile platforms, over 400 types of instruments in terms of make and model, all kinds of data formats, processing levels. Some data streams come in real time via the networks, and some of them are delayed mode with autonomous platforms. This is all very dynamic, both in the accumulating of the data streams real time, but also a lot of data reprocessing and data product code versioning over time to make improvements and corrections. So a lot of diversity that we have to contend with here. This is a Canary funded initiative. This is Canary is a Canadian entity that has launched their first research data management call last year. And so I'm one of 9 projects currently, and they're really working at trying to strengthen the fair data principles being captured in the Canadian system. So in this project, I'm trying to implement the dynamic data citations that came out of the recommendations from the RDA data citations working group. And so in this is basically covering aspects of versioning, the query store, the resolving landing page, and how to maintain the system over technology migrations. So we're going to be doing a lot of provenance and versioning changes in our system. We had a lot of versioning, or we already do have a lot of versioning traceability, but it's bundling that up to what represents versioning associated with the data set. That's the challenge. So we'll, of course, be using Cite and ORCIDs and contributing to this National Data Services Framework concept in Canada. So we are currently members of the World Data System, but as we go for renewal in our Core Trust Seal recertification, this will help us to meet the criteria of the requirement 13, all about data discovery and identification. We have a design challenge, as I mentioned, some of these heterogeneity issues, but also we have to really work carefully at defining our data set granularity and our architecture. And this is so permanent, and we have such a large data set scope to deal with. We're really taking our time in this design area. It's also a cultural challenge at Ocean Networks Canada, because we are a very agile and innovative culture. And so having this concept of something that has to be persistent over this, like, however long time period is actually a difficult cultural thing, because we always want to be shifting and changing, but now we have to have this piece of the framework that has to be very stable. So the system architecture, this is just a cartoon diagram, the architecture. So in the blue is our Oceans 2.0, which is our platform for data discovery and data management. So in there would be the ISO 1915 records that would, of course, point to the DOI, the files themselves. Our Postgres database handles all our metadata. Cassandra database handles all our parse data. We'll be adding in the citation resolving landing page in the UI, as well as extending parts of our data search interface and the data discovery and delivery APIs. We already have our DAP servers, but we'll have to be associating that properly with our DOI information as well. And then, of course, on the outside, we will be working with the ORCID and Dataset APIs, our data partner data sets, and the harvesters. So the dataset granularity question is actually really challenging for us. So we have to think about, okay, do we limit by time, by geography, by the instrument type, by the platform, by the data product processing level? So we've been thinking about all these things very carefully. And we also have other constraints, of course, by the kernels for Cite, but also our data partner attributions and our end users. So we have to we have data policy constraints that are differing with our data partners, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution at ONC, so we really have to be careful that our data sets allow for these distinguishing characteristics with our data partners. And so we've decided that we're going to move forward with this per instrument deployment concept, as that's our level of granularity, whether it's on a fixed or a mobile platform. And so, and that would encompass all data products available. So that's the raw data, and any derived products would be considered within the scope of one data set. And then we're allowing for that because our subset query PIDs in our query store would take care of the different products and the different sub-entities within that. So we still have that information as part of the citation. So we've been also working with this RDA dataset granularity working group and thinking about that. So if you're also debating some of these issues, I think it's worth participating. It's really important, I think, to have these community conventions for defining the dataset granularity, because when you're trying to do networks of data repository and aggregate your information together, it really helps in any kind of interfaces that are trying to pull data sets from the different partners. So for instance, we're part of a new infrastructure called the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System. And so we're all working together to try to have at least a somewhat compatible way of defining our data sets so that the visualizations can more easily find the right data that they need for that Canadian level harvesting that's coming from all different, well, 4 different nodes within Canada. So that's one of the reasons why we're really trying to think carefully too with our partnerships. So the dataset collection piece is something that I'm also really looking at. So how do we aggregate data sets? So we're looking at deployments over time of the same device category on the same platform over time, looking at CTD casts that are repeated at a station. And so different ways of collecting, so making it easier for the users to cite the data or to discover the data. And then we have this additional challenge where not all instruments have like their raw data being distinct. So for instance, we have some data streams where one instrument collects the data for another instrument because it might be on a voltage port, or it might be just, well, another odd case is we have a wave glider that's going to be going along the surface of the ocean, but it's actually going to be collecting data from the instruments on the seafloor acoustically. So then the raw data has data for instruments on the seafloor in the wave glider. So we have to figure out how to like recognize these data set distributions. So like I said, we have all these data agreement attributions we need to think about. We've done the mapping of the ISO 1995 roles to the Dataset roles, figuring out how to define the attributes for these granularity. By that I mean, so some of their attributions from our data partners, let's say you have a hydrophone and it produces the wave files. So the wave files might be owned by one party, but then derived data products like a spectrogram actually might be owned by another party. So we actually have that level of ownership that we're dealing with. And a whole host of different institutions with all their different needs and wants. So I'm just going to jump over our dataset attribution page. When to mint is a really difficult problem. So we have all these data streams that come in immediately, but we don't have perfect metadata at the get-go. And so we need to think about what way to automate that minting in the first place. So that's something that we're working on. We've already got a scheduled job set up to automatically detect when there's a new deployment on a device. And so we're now working on the refinements of how to make sure that the data is all, the metadata is all there that's needed and correct. So we're going through all the different requirements from the RDA data citations working group, like I mentioned. So versioning is a big piece of it. We're having to aggregate all our different aspects of versioning that fit in. So the reprocessing, the metadata history, changes to our parsing. So all these things we're figuring out the mechanism to aggregate them upwards. One thing we're concerned about is that we have a trigger, say we're about to reprocess or we started the job to reprocess, but it doesn't actually finish for like maybe, well, sometimes a few hours, sometimes a few days. So we're going to be doing the versioning at the end of that, but there's this time period where it's executing that someone could download the data and it's sort of between versions. This is sort of illustrate the complexity of the contributors to versioning. This diagram just indicates the original minting. Then we have a calibration correction. We might have to reprocess. We get a new DOI, continue to gather data, and then finally recover, and that's the end of the data set, just as a simple cartoon. This is our reprocessing console. So we also have to consider what happens. We start a reprocess job and maybe it gets canceled, maybe it fails. So how does the automated versioning handle those changes or problems? Parser modifications. Our query store is pretty complete in terms of the RDA requirements. So it's just marched through the requirements 3 to 9 that are part of those requirements, and we're pretty much meeting those already. Our query store handles which exact data product format they requested, which time period, any specific data product options, like whether or not they get the clean data or the raw data, or any specific parameter choices that are available on that data product. Our landing page and web services, part of the requirements, and so these are a list of goals to include, including the schema.org. This is our current mock-up of our landing page with all those details. And the technology migration policy piece, there's 2 requirements from RDA for that. So we're going to be having specific unit tests, regression testing, maintenance plans to handle that. And some additional items, we're extending our data model to better handle the geographic extent metadata needed, because currently we take really good care of where the instrument is positioned, but if it's a remote sensing instrument, we don't currently have the metadata to capture the geographic extents that well, so we're working on that, and upgrading all our user documentation for how to do the citations and educate the data providers on these procedures and changes. So I'll leave it there, and I guess we can't take questions now, but I'll take questions in the discussion. And I realize I skipped over some of the content, but it's all there in the online, so.
Yes. Okay, so thanks, Raina. And let's see if there's any comments. Are we gonna... Okay, so let's see. I'm gonna make Alex the presenter now. Okay, Alex, I think you're a presenter now. And you're still muted.
Hello, right.
There you are.
Here I am. So this is the first time I've done it on this. So
I just need you to share your screen now.
I am pressing the button and nothing's happening. Let's have a look.
You also need to select like what you're sharing too, I think. There's a little drop down thing under the play button for show screen.
Right. Okay. Sorry, everybody. It is possible. Should have practiced this beforehand.
It's hard to practice if there's no presentation, though.
Right, I'm switching to a div browser.
Oh.
So I'm now on as Alex Paul 2.
Okay, so now you're on here twice. So let me try your other one then. Okay. I made your second being presenter now. Oh, there we go.
Right, here we go. Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Ball. I currently work as a research data librarian at the University of Bath, where my main responsibility is developing and maintaining our institutional research data archive. On the side, I also implement the university's recommended citation style for LaTeX and citation style language. But in a previous life, I worked for the UK Digital Curation Centre, where my colleague Monica Duke and I co-wrote a guide to data citation and linking, the first version of which was published in 2011. I gather this has been quite well received, and I guess that's the reason why I've been invited to speak to you today. So since this session is about judging what makes a good citation, I thought I'd start by setting out what I personally think are criteria for making that judgment. So this is my list in approximate descending order. From the perspective of the citing author and the reader, this is probably the most important, the location, which is why in informal communications like blogs or forums, you generally see just bare hyperlinks instead of the full citations. The next thing is attribution, and this is often required by licensing conditions, and it's necessary in order to assign due credit and to fight plagiarism. In terms of identification, there are two aspects to this. The ID, first of all, provides something unambiguous to search for, answering the question, which item did you actually mean? And second of all, when you find an item, it provides a way to the answer the question, is this the right one? Now, all the above is great when things go right, but what if something goes wrong? You need some kind of resilience built in. So you need some redundancy in the citation to protect against typographical error. So if one element is wrong, the resource can still be identified and located with the remainder. And similarly, you need sufficient clues to protect against changing circumstances. So if the website changes or the archive shuts down, there's still enough information to track down the copy. And last on my list is relevance. It's very helpful to have some basic idea of the scope and the coverage and the quality of the resource, so you can answer the question, is it going to be worth my time looking this one up? And that's something I'll come back to in just a moment. But I think what makes the DCC guide so relevant for this session is the section where it talks about the elements of a data citation. We deliberately didn't talk much about how to format the citation, as I'm strongly of the opinion that the data citations should match the format of the rest of the reference list, which is why we provided examples from some of the major style manuals. And that's also why at the archive in Bath, the citation that we provide there, we call it the sample citation, not an official citation, because we fully expect people to have to reformat it when they put it in their paper. But going back to the guide, what we did at the time was compare 4 different papers which had a rationale for constructing data citations in a given way. So what we did, we looked at the elements that they had in common and what elements were unique to a given proposal. So these are the 4 proposed citation styles that we found in the literature of the time, and the elements that they use. They start with the author, which are the individual or corporate creators. The Altman and King proposal had a secondary slot, which becomes in effect a contributor list, but that's probably better dealt with in a more scalable fashion by an associated metadata record. The next is publication date, which is very useful for judging relevance in the sciences, but it's also good as a finding aid for for all domains really. The title is again very useful for relevance, and it's traditionally the most effective part to search on. When we get to version, this is where we start to get some variation between the different styles, because the thing is with the version is it's not always relevant. I mean, in our archive at Bath, most data sets usually only have the one version. Some other places may not have discrete versions at all. But on the other hand, the UK Data Service, for example, releases data sets in editions with version numbers reserved for trivial corrections within an edition. Now, this is probably the most mysterious of all of the data citation elements that we came across. It's used uniquely in the Lawrence element, which is this idea of a feature, which I think they're using to try and pick out a subset of the data. And there's a question over whether that sort of thing really should be in the reference as it is in the reference list, or whether that really belongs more in the in-text citation, where you can actually go into a bit more detail about how to extract a particular subset from the larger intellectual entity. Resource type is used to identify data sets as data sets among the other types of resource that there are in the reference list. Could be potentially a problem, as I know of cases where publishers have stripped out the data citations, but I hope that practice is starting to die out now. The publisher or the data archive, more commonly the case in this type of thing. Now that access tends to be from the publisher website instead of the library shelf, the publisher's city is largely irrelevant, and it's that's why it's missing, I guess, from all of these examples. But the name of the publisher is still useful for gaining access to the data sets, and it's also potentially useful as a mark of quality. The styles are unanimous in all, including an identifier, which is an interesting point, because even before DOI started to become popular, you hardly ever saw identifiers in citations. You can tell this is from a decade ago, as apart from Altman and King, all the styles were very keen to keep the location of the dataset distinct from the identifier. The access date, only the green example includes this. The others are quite content that an identified resource won't change over time. And I guess one reason why Altman and King are relaxed about this is their proposal for a unique numeric fingerprint, which is a sort of hash over a canonical format and bitstream independent representation of the data. So if you look at the list of elements that all of them have in common, it shouldn't really come as a big surprise. These are mostly the elements that you will traditionally find in any citation. And if I map them onto the criteria that I showed you at the start, we get a very good fit. So I'd argue that all of these elements are necessary for a good citation, but the question is, are they sufficient? And I think that the main thing that's missing is the version number. So for the last part of my talk, I'd like to beg your indulgence, as I do apologize that the next few slides are something of a rant, but I think it's something that I need to get off my chest. It's all relevant to this issue about the relationship between versions, identifiers, and locators. So when I first saw the first edition of the ECIP data citation guidelines all those years ago, I found the section at the end, note on locators versus identifiers. If you're not familiar with this section, it starts by explaining that identifiers identify and locators locate, and while you might be able to identify something by where it normally is, things move around and swap over and so on. But then it comes out with this line, confusingly, a digital object identifier is a locator. Now, I definitely find this confusing. One way to make it less confusing would be to put an also in that sentence, because the section does seem to be a little bit skeptical about whether DOIs identify anything. But just look at it. I mean, this is a DOI by itself. It doesn't tell you anything about where the resource is. It's quite clearly an identifier. In order to get a location, you have to put a resolver service in front. But this isn't the only resolver you can use. I mean, we used to be recommended to use this one. The generic handle one works as well. So we've just generated 3 different locators from just the one DOI. But I think concentrating on the location aspect rather misses the point, because with content negotiation, you can use exactly the same URL to retrieve a formatted citation for the object, or a citation style language record that you could import into Zotero, for example, or you could even get the full metadata record that's been registered for the object. My point is that there's a whole suite of services built around DOIs, of which redirecting to a landing page is just one. And if that's not enough for you, then the International DOI Foundation is pretty clear that DOIs are not actually locators. But then, presumably bouncing off that confusion, we get there's this statement that there's no guarantee that the object at the DOI's registered location will remain unchanged. And my concern with this sentence is that it seeks to normalize what should be an exceptional circumstance. And, taken literally, it's quite easy to disprove, because it is actually written into the contract that we have with the British Library, who is our national data site agent, that the items that we mark with a DOI remain the same over time, precisely so that we can guarantee that when people look up the data set, they get back exactly the same thing that was cited. And you can see the UK Data Service operates the same policy. So that's at least 2 guarantees for you, albeit limited ones. And from the conversations I've had with a wide range of stakeholders, not just among data archives, but among journal publishers as well, I think most are operating on the principle that the DOI should be a guarantee that the content won't change, so it can be cited reliably. And I'd argue that's why style manuals like APA in Chicago now distinguish between the online resources that require an access date and those that don't. The other thing that throws shade on DOIs as identifiers is that multiple versions or representations of the same data set may be located through one DOI, and two identical data sets may be provided and managed by two different repositories and have different DOIs. And yes, I admit there is evidence to support both of these statements, but I get the feeling it's trying to give the impression that this is like fine and normal when it isn't. DOIs must have exactly one reference, which is the version of record, and the referent should have at most one DOI. The only reason for a referent to have more than one DOI is if there is no official single version of record. So at our repository at Bath, we only mint DOIs for the datasets where we hold the version of record, and for the other ones we display the DOI that's been minted by the repository where the version of record resides. For the case of multiple versions that are under the same DOI, it might be helpful to have a look at a generalist repository that does this. When you release data through Zenodo, you get two different DOIs, and they explain this by saying that these DOIs are actually identifying different things. One is the version DOI that identifies the actual data set itself. The other is a concept DOI that identifies the sort of abstract concept of the data set. The way it's currently implemented, concept DOIs do something a little bit odd, which is to identify one thing and redirect you to the landing page for a different thing, specifically the latest version in the series. But if you look at the help page on this, they admit that redirecting to the latest version is bad practice for a DOI, and they promise to stop doing it. They also discourage anyone from citing the concept DOI, and just for good measure, they apologize for the formatting convention of their DOIs. I get the impression that maybe they did a lot of things because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and then someone had a quiet word with them. But I think you get the point by now that I'm a strong supporter of giving each new version a new DOI, and you're probably thinking, well, yes, that's fine for you. It works for mildly dynamic data sets, but how does that work with highly dynamic data sets or for databases that are constantly changing? There's different ways of dealing with this. You could just have your concept ID as from the Zenodo model and use some other mechanism to identify sort of historical snapshots, which may or may not be retrievable. I think this is probably where most of us are at technologically. As mentioned, we'd be in breach of contract if we tried to use a DOI for this at Bath, but we could easily use a different ID scheme or a persistent URL for this. You have to stop and think, though, that if you're not actually able to retrieve the past state, is this really citable in the sense that we really need it to be in this stage in the evolution of the area? Another solution for data sets that expand but are rarely revised, if there's no pressing demand for them to be immediately citable, then packaging the data into citable time slices is one way forward. In practice, you don't see this done very often because it's awkward to have to cite many such time slices if you're taking a much longer longitudinal view than is kind of expected by the archive. I think it's more common to package up citable snapshots every so often. So the Sewage Analysis Core Group Europe releases annual snapshots. Rothamsted Research tends to release paper-specific snapshots. And there's no reason why you can't run this kind of model in parallel with the first option. The only trouble is that if you are dealing with big data, it can waste a lot of disk space unless you have a clever system for deduplicating the data on disk. And that leads me to the solution from the Research Data Alliance, which is the one Rainer was just talking about. So if you're not familiar with this, it's the idea is that you version control your database and you log the queries that are made against it. And it's the result set from the query that is made citable with the DOI, not the sort of intellectual entity of the data set. So then when you request the data by DOI, then the system looks up the timestamp of the original query that that's associated with and reruns it against the database as it was at that time to regenerate the result set for you. Now, as you'll have gathered from Rainer's talk, this does require some sophisticated engineering, and it's not something I think we could hope to implement at Bath anytime soon. But I do think it's the most intellectually satisfying and efficient way of being able to cite exact versions of a dynamic data set using a DOI in the way that DOIs are intended to be used. So that's all I had to say. And again, we'll be happy to discuss any of the points I've raised a bit later.
Thanks, Alex. That was really interesting. Let's see if I can make myself presenter again. Okay, and hopefully you're all seeing my screen now. Okay, so Madison, you're up next.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about how we do data and software citations at USGS. And I guess I'll start off by saying I may make Alex's head explode with some of the ways that we do things. But we are having conversations at the moment, and so things might be changing here soon. We'll find out, but not during my talk. Okay. So USGS has data management and software management policies that briefly touch on data and software citations. Basically, they say that data and software releases must be assigned digital object identifiers to help with citation. So the data management policy does state that data releases must be accompanied by a recommended citation. But as far as I know, no such requirement exists for software releases at this time. Okay, so this is what our recommended citation looks like for USGS. The format and elements are based on the USGS citation style dictated by the USGS Science Publishing Network, so kind of the organization within USGS that publishes our internal, or not internal, but like our internal organization that publishes reports and things through the USGS. And so this citation is similar to what we use for books, periodicals, maps, and reports. So we have our author list, the publication year, the title of the data or the software, and then we have the USGS series. So for data, it would be a data release. For software, it would be a software release. And then we have the DOI. And then the Science Publishing Network specifies that the author should include the access date when using the data or software in a manuscript. So another group within USGS, the Fundamental Science Practices Advisory Committee, they're the ones who establish our data and software management policies, has published guidance on revising public data. So this includes recommended citations for those version data. However, this committee is in the process of updating the guidance, so we'll see in the coming months if any of this changes. So for versioned data, the title and the DOI do not change. Sorry, Alex. But the minor or major version number and the version date is added behind the title. Additionally, the publication year should reflect the year that the new version is released. So this is what our guidance states. And I'll just add in also that where there are versions, there's supposed to be a version history text document on that landing page describing what has changed. So if somebody comes to an older version or sees a citation for the older version of that data set, they should be able to get an idea of what has changed. So the USGS also does have a few enterprise databases, and the Science Publishing Network has provided guidance on how to cite these databases. Now this looks extremely complicated. I apologize, the color explosion. But so basically, the citations for databases should use they do use this institutional authorship, the publication year, the particular data set identifier and kind of title of the subset that you're using, the database name, so that's what we have there in green, the access date, the DOI, and then the author should include search parameters or additional information in brackets following the citation to enable users to get back to the exact data used. So as Alex said, maybe this information is better provided within the text of the manuscript as opposed to in the citation, but this is what our guidance says at the moment. Okay, so we still have a lot of questions around citing data at the USGS, and I'd say we're a little bit further behind on software citations. So our goal is at the end of the summer to convene a working group to discuss some of these questions and figure out a best approach for USGS data. But here are some of those questions. So what is going to be our approach or the best approach for citing granules? Is it appropriate for authors to change over time in citations for different versions, given that right now they say that the DOI should remain the same for different versions? Do we need to differentiate between new versions and updates at USGS kind of per ESIP guidelines? Right now we kind of think of the two as the same thing, but should we be differentiating that? And then how are we going to cite dynamic data at USGS, given that some of our databases are reluctant and don't have the resources necessarily to go all the way toward like the RDA recommended approach. So I'm going to keep it just short and sweet, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions after the following two speakers. So thank you.
Okay, so next we have Heather. Let's see if this works. Does it work? It's not doing anything. You might have to stand up here.
All right, people, I'm gonna wake you up.
Yeah, you gotta stand behind the podium. I'll introduce you. So this is Heather Brown from NOAA NCEI in Asheville. So she will give us the NOAA perspective on citations.
All right, guys, y'all awake? I know we're ready to be done for the day. We're towards the end. I was gonna try and walk around, wake you up, wake myself up, but apparently they don't like me to do that. So I'm Heather from NCEI, Heather Brown. For those of you who don't know what NCEI is, it's the archive for NOAA, the National Centers for Environmental Information. My boss doesn't like me saying this, but we used to be an ODC and GDC and CDC. We're just NOAA's information archive, okay? Let's see. So we're just going to go over citations, but I wanted to give you a little history, not only for NCEI, but myself. So when we say citing data, as we've kind of pointed out with Rena's talk, Alex's talk, everybody's trying to go over, how fine do we go to this? Is it granular? Is it a collection? What exactly do we cite? Is it software? Is it a physical samples? I know there's a big conversation about that earlier today. What is it we cite and why do we care? Why do we care? Why are we spinning and beating our heads trying to figure this out? Why? Because I have a story for you. I was an undergrad trying to do stupid, hurricane research for tornadoes, like people care about that. But I was trying to get the data and trying to actually replicate something that somebody had. And I bugged NCDC at the time. I was like, where did you get this? Where, I got this from you guys, but, where did you get it? I have questions for where this came from, and they didn't have a person there. They didn't know where they got it, and I was like, you're killing me. So I could not find out what happened. I eventually got someone on the phone that said, yeah, that was Bob's research. I think that's still on his server, but he retired last year. So kind of out of luck. And so that's why we do it. Because this day and age, we need to be able to reproduce stuff. There's no reason for us not to be able to reproduce a data set. There really isn't, except for the fact you just can't find it. So that being said, eventually NOAA agreed with me and wrote their own procedural directive on it. So they came up with the Citation Procedural Directive, and that's managed by the Environmental Data Management Committee, EDMC, which states, and I'm summarizing here and quoting a little bit, that NCI is the archive of the data. And we also work closely with the Central Library, NOAA Central Library, for publications and technical documents, just like USGS. We work closely with them on the standards and how we do everything, but we also look to ESIP for community guidance. But that said, the level of granularity in which a DOI is assigned is at the discretion of NCEI, but it's in collaboration with the producers. But also a DOI should be resolved to a human readable landing page. So I have to work with the provider, figure out how they want, what works for the granularity, for the level of aggregation. Sorry, I just gave away my tagline here later. The level of aggregation that a couple people have alluded to already. That how do we go down that rabbit hole without overburdening the system, the people, and the resources? And the reason this is, I'm going over DOIs, I know we're going over citations, but DOIs are really the driver for a lot of this. The scientists have a need to do reproducibility, credit, hence the Top Gun reference up here, feel the need for speed. This is the need for DOIs and citations. But the context is people want reproducibility. They want credit. To be fair, I'm right there. To be fair, that's exactly what we're here for, is because fair. We need it to be findable. What's the other part? Accessible, yeah. We need it to be fair. But at the same time, we're in this complex world that everyone's already talked about. I knew what order I was going in, so I didn't want to go over the details. Technology, collaboration, but yet everybody wants everything now. When we used to do citations, they were on papers, books, things that weren't done or created on an hourly basis, things that weren't done in near real time. So now we're trying to do citations for things that are done in a repeated dynamic way that we have to search outside from the entire world, not just in some library. So citations are just but a grain of sand to help us with this need. in order to get through doing fair and reproducible traceability. So NCI, back to how NCI does it. We use the standard ISO metadata. I would give a number, but that's going to be changing soon. It's just -1, -2. But we do use a HTML landing page to stay up with the procedural directive. We make it user HTML friendly, but the metadata is behind this, so it can be dynamically updated. That metadata is harvested by various catalogs. We also, the DOIs that we do mint are created through a separate entity called Dataset, which Jessica's going to talk about a little more. But only some of those fields are what we use. Whoops. And again, we'll allude to those in a little bit. But the future is for everything to be dynamic, auto-generated, and reproducible kind of on the fly. So that's where I was wanting to know what you guys were doing now and how you guys looked to do going in the future. And my thing got messed up here, sorry. So the fields we currently capture in Dataset are author, creator, or in for the citation, release / publication year, title, version, subset used, if applicable, publisher, DOI, persistent identifier URL, and the access date. But with that, I really wish that hadn't gotten changed, sorry. But those have caveats, as everyone has already explained, you know, peoples versus entities. Some people, they come and they go, you know, org IDs or not. Release year, sometimes it's unknown. Having done some digging up of digital data, I didn't know, only thing I had was a system date when we got it. I don't know when it was actually published. There are things like title. I've had so many arguments, Nathan, you totally understand this, on what is a title? What do you put in that? There's arguments about that. Versions, by far, we've already talked about that one. Subset used. And how do you get that information? There's some ways that we've talked about, Alex especially alluded to, was how to dynamically generate those through the service that you got the data from and having a URL that had the intelligence to make that. But then there's publisher, which is kind of arguable, but I think we're getting the culture on that one. The DOI and the URL, again, persistence, ensuring that. And then do we do granules? How far down do we make those DOIs? And access date. It's kind of hard to validate that one unless you use the subset used type of technology. Because the access date, who knows if the grad student remembers what date they got it from, whatever service. You know, that's hard to verify that that is actually when they got the data. So hopefully this session can really go through and we can talk about more of these in the discussion. But I did want to show you our landing page and our citation, what it looks like, but also allude to that we have a session tomorrow on, are you aggravated with your aggregations? Please come and work with us on an experiment on a decision tree. And if you use this Slido question, it'd be helpful to have that done beforehand so that we can experiment with how you guys go through with your data providers in the process of defining their collections. That's it.
Thanks, Heather. And now, let's see. Okay, now it's my turn. So I'm going to talk, oh, why are you already? Oh, because you're on, okay, don't do that. So I'm Jessica Hausman. I'm at PODAC, which is one of the data archives within the Earth Science of NASA. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So I need to give you a little background of PODAC and its relationship to EOS-DIS within NASA, and then I'll talk a little bit how we do our DOI minting and registration, what our citations look like, the landing page, and also give some new plugs because we have new guidelines from ESIP on how to do data citations. They were approved not even a month ago, right? And then start the discussion, and hopefully there'll be a lot of contributions for that. And also for the ones of you who are on the GoTo meeting, I did make a Google Doc. I put the link in the bit.ly note. It's a bit.ly, it's in the comments, and it's also in the session description on Sketch. So first, PODAC. So we're one of 12 data archives within NASA EOS-DIS. So that's all the Earth science within NASA. So we kind of all fall under that umbrella. And then there's this part called ES-DIS, which is kind of the, I wouldn't say the management part, but kind of like the part that's the non-DAC part of EOS-DIS. So they're the ones that kind of help make the suggestions and also kind of the, I guess, mandates of what all the DACs need to do at a minimum. And they're the ones who actually do the DOI registration for us, except for CDAC and ORNL because they were doing DOIs before the other DACs were. So the DACs are responsible for minting the DOI. So that means we come up with all the information that ESDIS wants that they register, and then ESDIS does the actual registration for us. It's all done through Dataset. So Dataset is it's under Data 1, I think. No, it's its own thing. Okay, sorry. So I think a lot of us were actually reusing EasyID originally, and that's actually part of the University of California library system. And the state of California realized they were paying kind of these services for everyone else outside of California to get DOIs, so they kind of clamped down. So then Dataset said that we can provide the service for everyone. So there's these nice APIs that you can use to register your DOIs. So for ESDIS, these are all the fields that we provide to ESDIS when we mint the DOIs, but the ones in blue are the ones that actually get registered. So ESDIS actually keeps extra data, metadata fields that they use for themselves for metrics to see what DAC is doing what. We also to enhance our own metrics within our common metadata repository. But I bring this up because, so everyone basically says, so there, we use DOIs as our persistent identifier, the dataset title, the creator of the dataset, which DAC is the distributor, the year it was published, and the landing page URL. But we also keep this resource type, which I think is going to be important down the road as we try to give more types of objects identifiers and try to cite them. A special reference, which is just kind of like if the DAC and its community knows this data set by something else, you can actually register that with ESDIS. Since we are NASA, most of our data sets are coming from missions, so what mission project it's from, what instrument, and the contact. And so we do have an about page at PODAC on how to basically cite the data there. So you can have, it's pretty small, but we provide that information out to our users. And then also on the landing pages themselves, each data set has its own landing page. There's the DOI, and then you see there's a tab for the citation, and then you can actually get the citation. And this is new. We had this come out last month, where you can actually download the citations within specific formats. And then also this, so if you want to find more information out about this, come to the metrics session tomorrow that Madison is running at 10:30. The great thing with giving identifiers on data sets and citing it is now they're traceable and you can gather metrics and see what impacts they have. So Lewis McGivney developed an API on how we can now kind of scour what publications are using the data sets. And so you can click on that little thing that says 6 entities are using it, and then you can see what those references are for that. So come tomorrow if you want to find more. So that's PODAC. And now for ESIP, we have our new dataset citation guidelines. It's up on Figshare if you want to find out more. You can also do a search within the ESIP website. So, it's pretty similar. We have author, the release date. There's this thing too that says if it's updated. Basically, some of the data sets aren't static. Some get updated because they're appended, with more data at the end. Or if it's a climatology, that gets a little trickier. The title, version ID, the repository, your persistent identifier. In most cases, it's usually a DOI, and the access date. And then we have these additional constraints that you can have, or considerations that you can have as well, which is the resource type that I mentioned before. So is it a data set? Is it software? Is it a document? The roles, data within a larger work. So is this just like a data set that's within a larger, let's say a field campaign, for an example? Or is it related to another data set somehow? And also this micro and dynamic citations, which includes the versioning. It's kind of a different type of, so you have the dataset version, but then you might have these little subversions within it as you update the data and the subset used. And then there's also an additional part of the guidelines, which Alex mentioned earlier, which is this explanation of locators versus identifiers, and then also information on how you should format your landing pages. And Mark is here up front, who led that the guideline authorship. So if you have questions, he knows way more than you would ever think to know about citations and for data. And then this is just a quick summary of basically all that's been presented so far in a tabular form. So you can see the author creator is basically in all of them, which is good because the people who put work into this should be credited. The release year, so and the release year is not necessarily the same year. I don't consider it the same year as it was necessarily created. It is the year it is distributed, which sometimes isn't always the same, because you sometimes have to go through a vetting process, or maybe just find the right repository too. They all have a title, and as Heather mentioned, what does title really mean? Usually it's the name of the data set, but how do you name a data set? The repository, or basically where the data resides. And then USGS has their series, which is unique to them. Most of us do recommend having a date accessed in case there are small changes made to the forward stream, and some sort of identifier. And then for ESIP, we also have the additional fields, and Madison's example showed that as well. So before we go into the discussion, I also want to say AGU is coming up, and it's abstract submission time, and Mark's running one on citations. So if there's something that you want to discuss more in a large audience, would be a great place to submit an abstract to. And so we're going to start with the discussions. So I started some, you don't have to follow these questions. I just they're more prompts than anything else. So don't feel like if you have something that's not there, it's perfectly fine. And I'll just show you the bit.ly real quick. So that's the bit.ly there if you want to help type notes along the way, and then we'll consolidate them and provide them in a report to the research objects citation cluster. Can I make this bigger? Yeah. I'm just going to copy and paste this and put it. So I have a text editor. That's a PDF. Otherwise, yes. Yeah, that's what I'll do. Where's... Yes, I know this is super exciting to watch right now. Where's the... Oh, there it is. Oh, darn. Okay, can everyone see that? I'll make it bigger. Now you can see it. Okay, so if you want to follow along with the notes, that's the bit.ly there. Oh, it does? Sorry, I will change that then, because it should be more than just view only.
Yeah.
All right. And I don't think I need to be up here, right?
Okay. Well, I have a question. Yeah, I'm Ramapriyan from, I'll just say NASA rather than go over a long history. So I have a comment with respect to versions and DOIs. And if you have a situation where two versions never coexist, then it's fine to use the same DOI and carry on. But at least in our case in NASA, we have a period of coexistence of, say, for example, version 4 and version 5 going on for 6 months or a year. In that case, it's definitely handy to have distinct DOIs for the different versions. So that thought came to me while Madison was giving her presentation about USGS.
So for the people online, I think most of the room agreed with that statement. Different versions should have different DOIs. Yeah, it's on.
Yes, I'm Choni Xie from NASA as well, Goddard. And I have similar questions. Also, well, back to Alex's talk, there's two problems. Just like Rama mentioned about this, just different versions share the same DOI. That's one thing, right? And also on the other way, just one data have same data set have two different DOIs. That's I think probably. So we already identified this kind of problem, but are we going to resolve it or leave it the way it is? Yeah, that's my question.
Before I pass the mic, I can sort of address how we address that in the citation guidelines. I certainly understand where Alex is coming from, that that ideally anything that's different should have a different DOI. But in earth sciences, our data changes can change really rapidly and near real time. And so just from a management sake, that's impractical. The best way to address that is the dynamic data citation guidelines, but they can be burdensome to implement, especially if you have very complex data. So we have discussion in there about sort of really workarounds, and Alex talked about some of them, the time slices and the snapshots, and then the way Madison described it, basically allowing the humans to make some interpretation. And so the guidelines recommend what should be done, but they also recognize that how current practice sort of tries to hack through some of this, and usually it works fine for humans, but not so great for machines. The two data sets or one data set with two different DOIs, that is also not recommended practice, but it does exist. And it will continue to exist even if we recommend against it. So we say that in those cases, you should use something like a same as sort of a description, like in a schema.org description on your landing page. And so that, again, those are just sort of hacks recognizing reality while we hopefully over time work towards the ideal.
Thanks. Sky Bristol, also from USGS, and some of those conversations that Madison mentioned were going on have involved me, so I thought I'd chime in because I actually didn't realize that that was our USGS practice to kind of assign the same DOI to this thing that changed and was mutable over time until it came up in one of the data sets that my team put out, and you know, one of the guys on my team was told, oh, well, your practice is to, you know, keep the same DOI and we'll just post a new version of this data set. And I said, what? That's crazy. Why the heck would we ever do that? So I kind of wholeheartedly agreed with Alex's basic premise there, but I do understand the practicalities of it. And it kind of comes down to, for us, I think the purpose of the DOI and what it means to many of our practicing data publishers, the folks who are putting data out. And they're oftentimes seeing the whole process of getting a data release out and putting it online and getting this DOI as giving them the link that they can give out to everybody to get to their data set. They're not really seeing it in the same way as the citable entity, the thing that is going to be cited in some way. And so that's this kind of weird dynamic and culture that we're working through of how people understand the system and how it works and the purpose of minting a DOI and declaring this thing as something citable and then working it through. And so we have had some lively discussions about, you know, the process that we have right now and the way our policy works and everything else. And it is in debate, and we're going to kind of work through that churn. One of the things that we've done to try to look at the kind of pragmatic approach or the practicality of the whole thing is to really think about, well, what is the responsibility then of the repository and the service, the system that is providing these data out? And, you know, if we really are paying attention to what's happening with our data, and we put a data set out and we realize, you know, 2 weeks later or a month later or 2 months later that we had some issue with it and we need to go back, we need to correct a problem, we obviously need a new version of the data set, we need to deal with that in some way. Can we look at it and say, well, nobody's actually accessed this thing. Nobody's downloaded it. Nobody's accessed the web page for it. Nobody's even, you know, found that it was there online at all. They didn't discover it in a search. So maybe it's okay, and we can go ahead and we'll just, you know, slip a new one in here, and, you know, everything will be fine. But if we figure out that, hey, this thing's actually been accessed 5, 6, 8 times, and maybe it hasn't showed up in a citation yet, but, you know, something's going on here. So, you know, we really need to pay attention to that. So ideally, I'm totally with Alex. I think we really need to look at building our systems with that kind of resilience, because as soon as we put something out and we make it public, we really should not be messing around with it without being very, very clear to both humans and machines what it is that they're getting on the other end of that. But pragmatically, we have to deal with the cultures that we're in.
Yeah, John Ralph from NCEI, and of course it's not just the cultures, it's you know, it's the administrative overhead, it's the cost of DOIs. I mean, we only have a small budget and we have billions and billions of granules going through our systems. So yeah, there's a lot of constraints, and we've had all these discussions in the cluster, and we'll continue to have them.
Is it all right if I cut in again here? I just wanted to say that I think part of the problem is that DOIs are just too good. I mean, this is what everyone thinks of as the standard way of identifying stuff. But you know, we're coming up against lots of situations where the social contract of a DOI being something that is immutable over time is just not working for certain situations. And I think, you know, there are other ID schemes available. There are, you know, if, you know, in the biosciences, you know, they've been trying to do this long before data DOIs became a thing. And, you know, you would have, you know, a reliable, persistent, cool URL and an accession number, which acted as a reliable identifier. And so I think, you know, some of these situations could be problems by not trying to fetishize the DOI and keeping that for a specific set of use cases, and trying to use, you know, alternative methods of identifying and locating for the other situations.
Yeah, I agree, Alex. This is Mark. And the guidelines do say that. It doesn't go into great detail, but that other identifiers might be better used for more of these detailed purposes. And one of the things that we're just finding in this more general research object citations cluster, where we're really sort of taking a step back at this, is that the two primary concerns of citation, credit, and access are often incompatible. And that it was fine for literature, but it's not so great for data sets. And the dynamic data citation protocol is, the RDA recommendation is really only geared towards the access question. And it doesn't actually fully address the credit question. And then the other thing is, I think we also just tend, and I think that's what you're getting at, Alex, is that we tend to overload our expectations with the DOI. And your comment that you didn't like the comment, the statement that there's no guarantee that what is at a DOI is immutable, maybe it should say there may be no guarantee. So it's clear that, you know, University of Bath has the guarantee, but it's also clear that USGS does not. And there's nothing in the technology of the DOI that keeps it immutable. It's that social contract piece. And that social contract is something that is geared at a different level than these dynamic issues. And I think this is an ongoing tension. I'll get to you.
Just a detail question for the gurus in the house. When you have two formats of the same data set, like a delimited text and a net CDF, same DOI with two data access links, or what's the best practice?
We're doing. I can see what we're doing in our project. So, you know, with every single data set, we're actually offering many formats, and we're handling the differences of formats within the query PID metadata. So when a user requests data, that, you know, if they requested the net CDF file versus the CSV file or whatever, that's retained in the query PID metadata. So that we still have those details in the citation, but it's when we register the data set, we don't have to register each data set at all the different data product options, because we have like in some cases we have like more than 20, so it'd be ridiculous. So we're just doing it at that query level.
Yeah, again, the dynamic data citation guidelines address that. But you could also do it through content negotiation.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on your, oh, sorry, James Frew, UC Santa Barbara. I wanted to follow up, Mark, on your comment about the overloading of the DOI, the credit versus access. And I think that some of the emerging solutions, like the one we've developed, but it's not unique in that respect, is when you split out the DOI from a query, that in many cases, and in particular for a lot of the NASA collections that we've messed around with, is also a very nice split between credit and access. Because a pattern we've seen is that you'll have a very large collection that grows by appending, or occasionally is slicked and then it becomes a new version and effectively becomes a new thing. But you have a large collection that grows by appending. So any reference to something that was already in it is immutable. As things are added, the collection itself changes, but existing references aren't changed by adding things to the collection. That's where the intellectual credit was in the development of the collection, the algorithms that were used to generate the product. And that's who you want to give credit to with the DOI. But it's ridiculous to talk about eating the entire collection. You have to query it in some way to get to the part of it that you're interested in. And that query that identifies the subset that you used is what you really need, both to access the data and also for reproducibility. So this separation we have now between DOI, which indicates in effect the permanent part, and the query, which indicates the particular piece that you pulled out or the particular subset, is actually quite workable. And the two of them together give you all of the pieces you need to satisfy the citation. But you need both.
I agree and disagree with that. Like, so there, I think that we still are overloading actually the actual data set DOI information, because when you register or you mint your DOI, say from Dataset, you still have to put right in there all your, all the crediting information, all the roles and contributors and the data policy information. So that's where things I think get really difficult in making your granularity choices, because they have to align with those items as well as what makes sense from a, other kind of perspectives. So I think that overload of the policy and the credit is actually challenging.
So I actually have
Heather Brown.
Heather Brown at NCI. So a question originally about having the two formats in a single DOI. I would say this is the negotiation part, because yes, you can have one DOI that has multiple different formats, as long as it's documented, it's not totally radical, like how different they are as far as content of the data and what's been changed. But I also have physical records that were East India trading logbooks, that have been turned into digital CSV files. Are they the same thing? No, they're not. So they get two different DOIs, and they're documented and credited differently. But they are associated through the metadata on which the DOI landing page does resolve to. So all the pieces that we were talking about, the citation that involves the access link, the DOI, the other pieces, the titles and all that, all those pieces, all those grains of sand equal what we're looking for, how to find out where we are. If we look at just the DOI, if we look just at the URL, if we look just at the authors, we're not going to find what we're looking for. We need all of them, because they're all pieces to a puzzle. You might be able to go and figure out a couple pieces and be able to figure out where you're going with this image, but it's not until you put that last piece together you're going to know exactly what you have. And that's where all this ties together. So that kind of ties your question in with the other question and your rebuttal. So
Before I pass it to Rama, any comments or questions from online? Okay, Rama.
Yeah, Ramapriyan from NASA again. I just want to respond to this discussion about a DOI for different formats. I think there is a distinction we need to make between archival formats and distribution formats. And if you have a data set that's been archived in a particular format and it's distributed in 10 different formats, you would probably have one DOI. But if it is archived in 2 different formats and these 2 things may diverge over time, then it makes sense to have 2 different DOIs.
John Ralph, NCI. I think that's where we start having to use like the OAIS reference model language, so we can describe the archive information package, which is in a specific format, and the dissemination information package, which could be reformatted in 20 different ways or whatever it is, but it's still the same data, and that's what the citation makes reference to.
Just a response to that, different formats may actually have a scientific difference. So fun little story. I worked to support a large field campaign 15, 20 years ago. And right before the American Geophysical Union meeting, the lead investigator for the field campaign called my data center in a panic and said, the data's wrong. And the data were not wrong, and they were well commented. The field samplers, this was a snow data set. The field samplers had made a choice not to sample in the designated location because of avalanche danger. And they annotated that in the data set, and that was captured in the textual version of the data set, but the shapefile version of the data set truncated the comments. So there was actually missing information out of that data. So they were actually scientifically different between the 2 different formats. So it is sometimes really critical to make that distinction.
One of the community fellow things they're asking us to do is to get you to define acronyms. So would you tell us what OAIS is?
Open Archival Information Systems Reference Model, an ISO standard.
It's like the baseline Bible for how you manage an archive. Oh.
Hi, Steve Diggs. with everyone doing what's expedient for them or what makes sense per data set, I even wonder, even within domains for people who are doing reproducibility, the rules of the road for navigating these persistent identifiers to get back to the original data changes from data set by repository and seemingly by measurement. And so publishing the rules of the road might be a good thing to do for the people who come in cold, look at the persistent identifier, and they wonder, you know, how to navigate after that to get back to the original data that was referenced in the publication.
This is Heather Brown again. I actually attend my session tomorrow at 3:30, and I will help you with the decision tree to do that.
Yeah, go ahead online. John online, you want to go ahead?
Oh, okay. It's interesting to me that it's John Graybiel from Stanford University. It's interesting to me how much the library community has followed a path of describing these different kinds of products that is, it seems to me, entirely analogous. And they are very clear that citing the work is a different thing than citing and annotating and commenting on an instance of that work, which in our case is something like different formats that might present the work in different ways, which is different from citing a particular item that is the work, a particular book that you hold in your hand, or a particular copy of the data records that you might have on your computer as opposed to somebody else's computer. And so these things are, these patterns, I think, are worth carrying over as much as we can. And I really like the division that was made between what the DOIs are good for versus what other things are good for. So I would encourage us to keep expanding that way of thinking to align with what these other communities are also doing.
Okay, we're nearing the end. Oh, you got more, John? Oh, no, all done, sorry.
No,
okay.
I was just saying all done, so you could carry on.
Okay, over. Any last comments? Okay, I want to give one last plug for my AGU session. It's not my AGU session, it's doing it with several others, Natalie and Nancy and Sophie. But it's called When to Cite a Data Set and or Other Research Object. And by asking the question when, we want to try and get at those questions of granularity, those questions of when in the workflow, you know, as we talked about earlier, that, or no, it was in another session, but like with samples, it's kind of at the collection time, whereas with papers, as the other extreme, it's at the publication time. And data might be somewhere in between, and other research objects might be somewhere in between. So it really, I think, tries to unpack some of these questions. So check that out.
And if you didn't get a chance to say something, or like, you know, you wake up in the middle of the night, it's like, oh, the notes are going to still be up. So please add to them even after leaving here. And we'll discuss it in one of our research object cluster meetings. And if you'd like to be in the cluster too, you can talk to Mark or I, and we'll get you hooked in.
Third Thursday of the month, I'm pretty sure, is when we meet, right? Well, it depends on what time, where you are in the world. It's on the ESIT page, of course. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody. This was a helpful session. And thanks to those online, and thank you, Alex, for staying up late.